Okay, welcome everyone to our first JStream of 2021. We are really excited to be having this conversation, and my name is Abby Kirschbaum, and I am the Assistant Director of Public Engagement and Educational Resources here at JStreet. And I'm going to be introducing some of our speakers and our guest moderator so that they can share their insights, deep knowledge, and perspectives. Before I introduce everyone, I would like to just go over a couple of housekeeping items. So for those of you part of the audience, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Q&A feature of Zoom. So throughout the duration of the call, we're going to be keeping the Q&A open. So feel free to direct all of your questions in that feature, and we will be sharing them with our moderator who will get to your questions. Okay, so now I am going to be introducing our speakers. First up, we have Reverend Dr. Mae Cannon. So Reverend Dr. Mae Cannon is an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church. Her ministry and professional background includes serving as the Senior Director of Advocacy and Outreach for World Vision US, the Executive Pastor of Hillside Covenant Church, Director of Development and Transformation for Extension Ministries as Willow Creek Community Church, and as a consultant to the Middle East for child advocacy issues for Compassion International. She earned her doctorates in history, PhD, and spiritual formation. Her PhD focused on American history with the minor in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of California, Davis, focusing her dissertation on the history of the American Protestant Church in Israel and Palestine. Cannon's doctorate of ministry and spiritual formation is from Northern Theological Seminary. Cannon holds a master's in divinity from North Park Theological Seminary, an MBA from North Park University School of Business and Nonprofit Management, and an MA in bioethics from Trinity International University. Cannon completed her Bachelor of Arts degree at the University of Chicago in History, Philosophy, Social Sciences of Science, and Medicine. And next, we have Greg Khalil, is the co-founder and president of the Telos Group, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that equips American leaders and their communities to better engage seemingly intractable conflict. Much of Telos's work has centered on the role of faith leaders and cultural shapers in America's relationship to Israel-Palestine and the broader Middle East. Prior to founding Telos, Greg lived in Ramallah, the West Bank, where he advised the Palestinian leadership on peace negotiations with Israel. Greg is also a founding member and chair of the board of directors of Narrative 4, a global nonprofit that seeks to use story and media to cultivate empathy across divides. He has lectured on the Middle East and has been published by the Review of Faith and International Affairs and the New York Times. Greg is an adjunct professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism and is a former affiliate fellow of Harvard's Religion, Conflict, and Peace Initiative. He graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles and Yale Law School and currently resides in New York City. And now for our guest moderator, Arianna Skibell. Arianna is a writer and reporter based in DC. She currently covers climate change and energy policy for E&E News at Politico. Prior to that, Arianna spent a year living in Jerusalem as a de Rote Fellow, where she researched and reported on the intersection of land, identity, and religion. Her work has appeared in Jewish Currents Magazine, 972, Israel Story Podcast, Science Magazine, and Salon, among other outlets. She holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University and a BA in psychology and linguistics from Emory University. Arianna grew up in a modern Orthodox shtetl in Atlanta and found her Jewish home through Adamah farming program at the Isabella Friedman Retreat Center in Connecticut. Wow, we have some really exciting speakers and a great moderator for you. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Arianna.
Hi, hello, everyone. So I'm really excited for this conversation. And I was hoping that we could kind of just start by hearing from each of you a little bit about your personal journeys that brought you to this work. We heard your amazing, impressive bios, but what brought you to where you are in a more personal narrative form? Mae, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. And nice to virtually meet you. And thank you for hosting us. And thank you for JStreet as well. I've had the privilege of speaking at some of your conferences. And so I'll settle for the virtual connection until we're able to physically be together again. My background, I'm ordained in an evangelical denomination, one of the few that actually ordains women. So my credentials, some of those master's degrees and schooling, they come from traditionally evangelical institutions. some of which are so conservative that professors or students wouldn't teach me different subjects because of my gender. And so that's a bit of my background. I was in the local church for decades, longer than I care to admit, just in terms of my age. But my second calling was to the Middle East. And so that's when I focused my doctoral work on the relationship between evangelicals and Israel specifically. I had the privilege of living in Jerusalem in 2010 and 2011. And I had dreamt of going to Israel from the time I was a little girl, as many evangelicals do. It was a significant place historically. The history of the Jewish people was something that I had studied and was fascinated by. And so when I was finally able to travel there, the place and the people came to life in a very significant way, which I'm grateful for. And my work now is as the executive director of Churches for Middle East Peace that represents 30 diverse ecumenical. It's a word that means diversity within Christianity, an ecumenical organization that represents 30 member communions, including Orthodox, Evangelical, Catholic, and mainline Protestant. And our work focuses on peace building in Israel, the Palestinian territories, and the broader Middle East.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
Well, Arianna, great to meet you, and Mae, great to share this panel with you. And thank you to J Street and everyone joining. I think this is one of the most important conversations to have at this particular moment, not just about Israel-Palestine, but a number of trends that are happening within our own country and in fact, globally. And what brought me to this place is a little more circuitous route, I think, than Mae's. I don't come from an evangelical background. My politics and worldview is liberal, progressive, but I was born and raised in San Diego to a Palestinian Christian father and a Danish mom. And so I always had this connection to my family in Palestine and very sort of different perspectives on how Palestine is viewed by Christians. So for example, I'm not actually joking, this happens literally all the time, that people will find out my ethnicity and then you assume I'm Muslim, so you're a Christian, oh, when did you convert? It's like 2,000 years ago. When did you convert? There's this lack of recognition of this community of out there, which happens to be, whether you believe or not, historically the oldest community of Christians in the world, because of course Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, and many of his first followers were heretics at the time. But that's where so many of the origins of Christianity began, just outside Bethlehem. So I always had this tension growing up in the States, professors for parents, and then a family out in Palestine that had a very different reality. And I felt later in life, I became a lawyer. I went and I felt that I had to do something. So I went and I served on the negotiations. And I saw two things very clearly there, only one of which I'll share in this introduction so I don't go on too far, but that there was a real sort of almost disdain among sort of the negotiations class of which I was a part for faith communities. And I don't mean that in so much in a pejorative sense, but from when we're in a negotiations paradigm, we operate through a prism of realpolitik. If you want to impact the world, the first step is to actually understand it, see it as it is. This is the Holy Land. The majority of people on the ground there care about faith. I know there's a place that probably many of you have visited, a hotel called the American Colony Hotel. And when I served on the negotiations from 2004 to 2008, any day you'd walk in there, you'd see all sorts of Israelis, Palestinians, internationals, journalists, all sitting there, and this is a place that you could go on Saturday brunch, have bacon and champagne, and then you're in the middle of an ultra, conservative, well, not ultra, but a conservative, observant Muslim Palestinian community, and just a few hundred feet away from Mea Shearim, one of the largest Orthodox communities in Jerusalem. So that I saw that there was this real disconnect. We thought, leave religion out. Like, what good can bringing this complexity into a too complex process do to actually achieve peace? And what I grew to understand and what drew me to this work was the fact that, wait a second, like, these are the people who care. These are the people who are going to live whatever peace is out. And there are literally billions of people around the world, oftentimes Christians, who are adopting a particular view that I believe is harmful to both Palestinians and Israelis, and for a shared future for Israelis and Palestinians. whatever the political accommodation. And there's no way to just ignore or will these folks away. You have to figure out how to engage some of them if we want to move forward towards a sustainable peace. So when I left, long story not so short, I founded Telos with a member of the State Department who's a conservative Republican evangelical Christian from Arkansas named Todd Deathridge. And a lot of our work focuses on engaging evangelicals, particularly American evangelicals, on a different way to see Israel-Palestine, one that promotes security, dignity, freedom for both Israelis and Palestinians.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a really excellent jumping off point to my next question, just in terms of understanding how much belief matters and how we can't sort of ignore what people believe and how that drives their actions when we're talking about this. So I think next, it would be really great if we just sort of, if you could both, from your different perspectives, give us a grounding a little bit in what the belief systems are that led American evangelicals to take such an interest in Israel, and how that belief has manifested politically. And I'm hoping we can kind of talk about somewhat historically, but and then sort of focus on what we've seen in the Trump era. So Mae, why don't we go back and start with you?
Sure. So it's interesting, and thank you so much, Greg. I love the story that you told about people asking, well, when did your people become a Christian? And so the Christian tradition and connections to Israel start from our love of the Hebrew scriptures, which is sometimes called the Old Testament for us, and the prophets and the Jewish people. And so many evangelicals believe that the Jewish people are chosen by God, for a unique purpose. And, I won't go through 2,000 years of history, but if we fast forward to the mid-19th century, there was a movement within conservative Christianity called Restorationism, which had to do with the belief that the Jewish people have to return to their historic homeland in order for Christ to come again. And a lot of the contemporary beliefs that we see of evangelicals have to do with roots in restorationism. And I saw one of the questions about, well, wait, what's an evangelical? And I'll just do a quick summary of what that is. There's 4 primary tenets to evangelicalism. Evangelical is based on the term good news, the good news of Christ. And so one is being Christocentric, that Christ is at the center and necessary for salvation. One is the belief in conversionism, that someone has to convert to believe in Christ as their savior. Another is baptism by the Holy Spirit. I said 4, and I just combined 2 of them. One is the esteem of the scriptures, that the scriptures are the inerrant word of God. And the final one is mission and activism in the world. And all of this relates to Christian views towards Israel and Christian views towards the Jewish people. So if you fast forward through history, there was a significant turning point for evangelical support of Israel in 1967. Many conservative Christians thought that the US, excuse the expression, was going to hell in a handbasket. You had a lot of unrest. You had the civil rights movement. You had, heaven forbid, feminism. You had all of these things happening in the 60s and 70s. And conservative Christians were looking for signs of the times and thought literally that this meant it was the end of the world. And what happens? The Jewish people of Israel conquer their neighbors, in a miraculous war in 1967, in the Six-Day War, which in large part further entrenched a lot of these what we call eschatological beliefs about the end times, that God is on the side of Israel. And then fast forward, several more decades since then, and you have Vice President Pence, the first vice president in US history, speaking at the Knesset, giving this talk about how the US, but US Christians is also what he meant, are standing on the side of Israel because Israel is on God's side. And the de facto message in that is that the Arabs are not, that the Arab Palestinian people are evil. So you have this kind of, eschatology, this framework of end times that a lot of conservative Christians look at conflict in Israel. The movement of the Jerusalem embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem was a further extension of this restorationist idea of a united Jerusalem that's completely controlled, by the Jewish people of Israel. So that's a bit of the history. I could go on.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just add for perspective, The evangelical lobby group, for those who don't know, Christians United for Israel, CUFI or CUFI, depending on who you talk to, boasts about, I think, 8 million members.
10 million.
10?
10 million.
Oh my gosh, it was 8 million like last week. Okay. Whereas AIPAC has about 100,000 members. And so we saw, and I think Pence was one of the first vice presidents to speak at the CUFI convention a couple years ago. So we really saw the really conservative evangelical, white evangelical Christian community having a direct ear to the White House. So Greg, if you want to add on to that, or I would also love to hear how, what the Trump era and the evangelical Christian lobbying efforts meant for the Palestinian Christian community as well, if you would want to address that.
Sure, I'd love to address that. I'd love to just add on to Mae's very helpful overview. I don't know how you did that in about 1 minute and 30 seconds, and really impressive. I think just two historical cultural points, and then bringing it back to the Trump era, and then concluding just sort of Palestinian Christian perspective. One thing that I learned, so my tradition, I grew up in an Orthodox Christian church, which is not evangelical, didn't have any of this end times theology or Israel chosen centric theology. And it's important to name both, because there's some Christian Zionists who really reject the end times theology, this prophecy about Jesus returning, at which time, all but 144,000 Jews will die in Armageddon, and then the remainder will convert, as Jesus returns. That motivates some, but it doesn't motivate a lot, and some, in fact, it doesn't motivate everyone, rather, but in fact, some reject that philosophy. But one thing that I started to learn, Mae was talking about the 19th century movement of restorationism, and there was a theology associated with this, which some may have heard of, called dispensationalism, whereby, Joseph Darby, this theologian, divided the Bible into 7 different dispensations of time. How do you understand God's story in this massive set of text from the beginning until the end? And that's significant for 2 reasons. One, Lord Balfour, the Balfour Declaration, he was a dispensationalist evangelical Christian. So was Sykes of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was the water they're swimming in. And there's not enough in the historical record to say that this was their motivation for supporting certain policies. But the reason why I'm making this point is I didn't realize, even though I was a student and working on the negotiating team until relatively late, just how much these communities and how much these worldviews had shaped the modern conflict from the very beginning. Second, in terms of culture, I think one thing, Mae, you grew up in this, I didn't, but there's a whole nother set of books and films out there that target tens of millions of Americans. And, there was a book in the 1970s, just, on the verge of the rise of the religious right, which I think, has manifested in Trumpism in some sense today, some aspects of it. There was a book by Hal Lindsey called The Late Great Planet Earth. This book outlined dispensationalism and Christian Zionism for a popular audience. It was the best-selling nonfiction, quote unquote, nonfiction book, not of 1970, but of the entire decade of the 1970s. Orson Welles hosted the miniseries. Could go on with that, but what I want folks to understand is that there are a lot of people, this was shaped in the water. They didn't have very deep sort of understanding about all of the theology behind it, but they received these messages like Israel is good. Israel is, the Jewish people are the apple of God's eye. You hear these stories, the Left Behind series, 7, New York Times #1 bestsellers. All of this has shaped the culture in which we swim. And then many decades later, you start to see the political maturation of this as the Christian Zionist movement with CUFI and other organizations start to say, hey, we've got to translate all of this goodwill, this energy out here into specific policy objectives. And that's what you saw with Trump. And, Mike Pence speaking at the Knesset, President Trump declaring, I did it for the evangelicals, talking about the US embassy move, and now seeing that AIPAC is, being transformed by evangelical presence, and the largest organizations in quote unquote pro-Israel organizations, we might take exception to that particular definition, are Christian. And so that happened and culminated now. I think the Palestinian Christian response, I want to be very clear. I'm not speaking as a representative of the Palestinian Christian community. I've spent parts of my life there, but I grew up here. I'm primarily American, and many Palestinian Christians would actually disagree with some of the positions I take and my organization takes. So I want to be clear that I'm not representative here. But Palestinian Christians in general have this sense of like, wait, what about us? Like, don't you actually care? Where do you think you got your faith? Jesus didn't come to Texas. He came to Bethlehem. How do you think this happened? You know, it was passed down over generations, over generations. They feel a real sort of resistance, even among evangelicals. So there are 15 active denominations of Palestinian Christianity, plus some evangelical denominations, even though it's only about 1.2% of the population. But yet Palestinian Christians will, you know, they've started an initiative called Kairos, which seeks to, it brands Christian Zionism as sin, and it's modeled on South Africa's Kairos Declaration, which was started in the churches against apartheid and to promote the boycott movement there. So there's a real strong push against Christian Zionism among Palestinian Christians, but it's a small, vulnerable community, and their voices don't have many platforms to be heard.
Thank you. Yeah. And just to also share, it might be interesting to people to know, you know, so much apocalyptic literature really is based, as you were saying, on dispensationalist thought. And there was a proposal put forward to create Palestine as a Jewish state by a prominent dispensationalist, I think 5 years before Theodore Herzl put forward that proposal. So the histories are definitely entwined. But so speaking about sort of how dispensationalist thought has really bled into all of these aspects, that so much so that we don't even sort of realize it, I was hoping you both could address the anti-Semitic nature of that thinking and how that has played out in American politics.
That's a great question and a good follow-up to what we were just talking about. One of the questions I saw on the chat was about 1948 and why did evangelicals shift their support in 67 and not in 1948? And in large part, the answer is anti-Semitism. I mean, fundamentalists, many of whom made up the American evangelical community in the early 20th century, were some of the leading anti-Semites in the world at that time, so much so that they supported the establishment of the state of Israel because they didn't want Jews to come to the US. They wanted Jews to go somewhere else. But in 1948, the leading Christians who were a significant part of the political movement and the political acknowledgement of the state of Israel's establishment in 1948 were not conservatives, were not evangelicals. They were actually they were actually Protestant liberals who supported the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948, which I think is a really kind of interesting point of history. And so the question of how does anti-Semitism relate, I think it's a very important one to acknowledge historic anti-Semitism in the history of Christianity and the way that has had different streams over different points, depending on which decade or which era it manifests itself differently. And so I think there's definitely an argument to be made that certain aspects of some Christian Zionist beliefs are anti-Semitic. They're very utilitarian in terms of their views of the relationship with the Jewish people. I know, and you acknowledged in a very constructive way, Greg, the way that many Christians who are very, very pro-Israel are not necessarily end times Zionists, in terms of believing in Armageddon, but the perspective, or at least the historic perspective of eschatology, is one that the reason the Jews have to be restored to the historic homeland is very not only utilitarian, but ultimately not in the best interest of the Jewish people, right? I mean, the 144,000 are the ones who will be redeemed when they convert, and those who do not, will burn in hell for eternity. Sorry to be graphic, right? And I think that is certainly an example of anti-Semitism.
I think this is a really important question, and it's one that so many Christians, evangelical and not, have to spend a lot more time exploring, because as Mae said, the origins of most anti-Semitism trace back to Christian theology, and not just for the past couple hundred years, for well over a millennium, for nearly 2 millennia. And so what we're seeing here, I want to just take one small step back, because I saw in the chat some confusion around the terms evangelical and Christian Zionist. Just to be very clear, not all evangelicals are Christian Zionists. In fact, many are not. And similarly, not all Christian Zionists have this apocalyptic end times view, though many do. And because like there have been all of these books and films about this over the years, targeting Christian audiences, not just in the States, but around the world, and we can get to that later, many people just kind of have these thoughts that have not really been sort of examined about sort of like Israel's special place in God's plan. And so a lot of Christian Zionist support comes primarily from that sense, is like, Israel is special. We want to bless Israel because God wants to bless Israel. He told Abraham, I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. So I just wanted to get some clarity on that, because this is a highly differentiated community. Evangelicals much more broadly, and from progressive left, from left of progressive, all the way to ultra-conservative, just as the Jewish community is highly differentiated as well. And so is the Christian Zionist community. So I think that's important for those of us who are thinking, how and where can we constructively engage? On the point of anti-Semitism, just to add one thing here, is the definition right now, as we know, is a little bit of a moving target. And so what we've seen culturally, in a sense, is that anti-Semitism is less concerned with some of these larger, beliefs that are historically, anti-Semitic in some circles, and more concerned with, do you support Israel? Do you support the Jewish people in the land of Israel? And I think, and forgive me for overstepping my bounds here as somebody who's not Jewish and who is Palestinian, but I spend a lot of time in a variety of communities in Israel-Palestine historically. I think among some communities, there's just a presumption that if you're not Jewish, and sometimes even if you are, you're anti-Semitic. So like, how can you actually be not, what does that really look like? Well, do you support us being in the land here? And, this prophecy stuff, well, who knows? Like, well, we'll all find out someday, or we won't. But in the meantime, like, do you support us? And the third small point there, which we might want to talk about later, is that this did not happen overnight. Sort of this fusion between many in the right in Israel and the Christian right in America and now around the world. This was something that was cultivated intentionally over decades with relationships. So as for us as outsiders, which all of us are, I mean, except Mae, you know this much better than any of us from a variety of perspectives. But my point for those of us on this call, like, a lot of these things from a distance may seem as like, how can you reconcile X with Y? Like, these are irreconcilable differences. And these communities, many leaders of them have been working this out for years, intentionally trying to sort of see where the lines of difference are, where they put the emphasis. And now you see, Christians United for Israel, which we've brought up several times now, their mission statement includes, defending Israel and combating anti-Semitism. That's how they conceive themselves. They would push back very strongly against the view that they're anti-Semitic, even though the founder, Pastor John Hagee, has created much controversy over the years with some of his views on the Holocaust, for example.
Yeah.
If I might just add, I got excited by some of the things I heard Greg saying. Not only would many Christian Zionists claim that they're not anti-Semitic, they would self-identify as philo-Semitic, as really wanting to appropriate aspects of the Jewish culture and esteem them and use them in their own religious practice. And in that regard, the other organization I think it's important for us to talk about is the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem. They used to claim that they were the only embassy in Jerusalem. It's one of the leading Christian Zionist organizations in the world. Many of their executive directors, you go into their lobby and you see pictures of all of the former prime ministers of Israel, and their pictures alongside of the leaders of the International Christian Embassy. And so you have major institutions that are very powerful, but I think, Greg, your point is so significant, and I just want to emphasize it. Christian Zionists are not monolithic, just the way that Jewish Zionists are not monolithic. And so often people will say, you have to oppose Zionism. Well, I think it's really important to say, what do you mean by Zionism? Because there are some Christian Zionists who just believe that Jews should be allowed to have, access to their historic homeland in the state of Israel, which I believe, right? And so in the movement of advocating for Palestinian human rights, there's also a significant anti-Christian Zionist movement that in large part, I don't think, and I'm just speaking personally, that it's the most constructive because it's not nuanced enough to talk about these differentials, that not all evangelicals are monolithic. Let's talk about the perspectives of evangelicals of color, that have very justice-oriented perspectives and want to stand in solidarity for human rights for Palestinians, while also having, acknowledging the legitimate security needs, of the state of Israel. And so I think in that regard, parsing and acknowledging that each community and each definition is not monolithic is actually really, really significant.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And it also sort of pivots perfectly into my next question, which is about the nuances of the landscape of evangelicals. But I would also just maybe like to clarify, this sort of, Greg, what you were talking about, where CUFI says that they are not anti-Semitic, they are philo-Semitic. And what you both have been saying about how that line is very blurry, right? So if it's, we want Jews to go to Israel so that they will bring about the end times and die or lose God's grace in whatever way, that's anyway. So yeah, there's a lot of distinction to be made there. But according to most polling or recent polling, I think 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. And Mae, as you were saying, that number does not include non-white evangelicals. And then there are many evangelical Christians, particularly millennials, who say they're actually not comfortable identifying as evangelical anymore for political reasons. So from each of your perspectives, where is the community today? And in particular, where is the evangelical left?
I can start and then have Mae fill in and correct as needed. So I think one, evangelical is also a moving target. The term did not have a political connotation as little as 15 years ago. It has become very politicized as a political identity. Mae identified sort of what evangelical means from a faith sense, but when you pick up a newspaper, most of the time pollsters and journalists are not asking people what their belief system is. Sometimes they do, there are groups that are targeted for this, but the majority of the time they simply ask, are you evangelical? Are you an evangelical Christian? Or have you had a born again conversion experience as shorthand to identify this, this group? So what we see happening right now is that we see that the word that many people who once identified as evangelical, and this is not the majority of them, but many are no longer defining as evangelical. Second, as we've alluded to, but to make explicit, often when you see evangelical in the press, it means white evangelical. Specifically white evangelical. The traditions, Martin Luther King Jr., he was a pastor, and faith-wise, evangelical, there's a rich tradition of social justice activism, and Mae actually wrote a book about this for evangelicals, within communities of color, specifically evangelical communities of color. Third, I'd say for the J Street audience to think about right now is that there is a huge generational shift here domestically in America. I want to put a footnote here because there's one trend in America with an opposite trend globally. And that's important for people to be aware of because no one's even having this conversation right now. And so what we're seeing just in terms of religiosity generally is that the fastest growing segment of the American religious landscape are the so-called nones, N-O-N-E-S, no affiliation. These are not atheists. These are people who still define as spiritual or theists. They believe in God, but they no longer attach to faith. And this attrition is really happening from evangelicalism. They're not self-identifying as evangelical anymore. And so what we're seeing right now, one that's just significant because many people may not realize, but America is an outlier among developed nations in terms of religiosity. More than 55% of Americans report praying every day. And that's an inverse correlation with almost every other developed nation in the world. So when you're looking at this data, we're really sort of unique in that sense. And so why this is significant for folks listening on J Street conferences, I remember, I knew Jeremy before J Street was founded, and got to know him a little bit then. And, there was a split, internal split within the Jewish community, often on Israel and beyond Israel. It's not just Israel, right? That was starting to seep out at times into the public square. I think we're at a similar space with respects to evangelicals. And it's not just Israel. It's a variety of things, from immigration to racial equity to what is the true expression of our faith? What should discipleship, meaning how do you follow Jesus as a Christian, really look like? And there's some counter movements that are really starting to rise up. They're still fringe, and we can talk about that more later. Just the last part about global contextualization, because there's been a couple of questions about that in the post. The trend is opposite globally. So there's this great irony. The theological roots of Christian Zionism often relate to many other things, such as manifest destiny. I don't know if you know, there were theologies preached around colonization and apartheid, saying this was God's will, and slavery. Almost every major Reformed theologist through the mid-1800s in America supported slavery as sanctioned by God, either acceptable or a good thing. Now, all of this, what we're seeing now in the global South, in Brazil, and sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, South Africa, Indian subcontinent, Oceania, like there's this resurgence, or this, not a resurgence, it's a rise of this brand of evangelical Christianity, which has these theologies, including Christian Zionism at their root. And it's just kind of ironic, given that these are often communities of color who were at the other end of colonization historically.
Yeah, I'll pick up on some of those themes. I saw the questions about, is this the same internationally? And I do think you actually have a lot of parallels, Australia, Canada, there's certain communities of evangelicalism in Europe that are very similarly following trends that are happening in the US. And I would actually say this is a significant point. Many people in the US who are being identified as evangelical are really more fundamentalist than evangelical. So, let's talk about Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, who's a far-right conservative. He's kind of esteemed as one of the leaders of the evangelical community. He's really much more fundamentalist, which I think is an important distinction. And one of the fastest growing communities in the church is the conservative church in Africa and the conservative church in Latin America, which then trends towards Christian Zionism, very conservative views towards Israel as well. I agree that I think it also depends on the generation. There's a significant generational shift between perspectives of Israel. Younger evangelicals, if they even call themselves that, are much more justice oriented, so have more holistic perspectives. There's a significant shift in terms of evangelicals of color. So I would point people to a group called Evangelicals for Justice. We just did a webinar on evangelicalism and nationalism related to race and gender this weekend. And there were some very interesting conversations about what's happening within the evangelical community, post-Trump's presidency. And that group is primarily led by evangelicals of color who would have a much more holistic perspective towards Palestine and towards Israel. And then finally, many evangelicals who are Christian Zionists or incredibly pro-Israel have no exposure to the Palestinian community or to Arab Christians. And so I'll speak at, conservative churches in rural Iowa, and I'll have evangelicals saying things to me, well, we would support the Palestinian people if they would just, acknowledge Israel's right to exist. And then you'll talk to them about the Oslo Accords and they'll have no idea what you're talking about. So they're operating on paradigms that existed in the geopolitical space in the 60s and 70s and 80s without acknowledging any of the history. And so it's a revolutionary experience when I talk to a lot of Christian Zionist groups to say to them, pray for Israel, but pray for the Palestinians too. And they'll say, you mean that's okay? Like I can still honor God and pray for Palestinians? Because it's very much outside of, they just have no exposure to a lot of the current realities, let alone terms like occupation or, terms that would be very familiar to those who are more aware of the geopolitical realities.
Yeah, so I think going off of that, I think exposure and understanding, a lot of people in the Christian community that I've spoken to have sort of talked about swimming in pro-Israel waters and not, they wouldn't have called themselves Christian Zionists, but like they knew that Israel was important. They knew that Jews were important. They knew it was important for Jews to be in Israel. And if a political candidate supported Israel, whatever that meant, as a kid, they're like, oh, that's a good thing. And then going on, I spoke to a young woman who went on a Telos trip and was like, I just had no idea what was going on. And I think we've seen a rise in sort of multi-narrative tours or more opportunities for dialogue or just witnessing. Can you speak about what you've seen in that regard, and how and what kind of impact that's having?
Sure. As you know, Telos, one of our key methodologies is the trip. It's the immersive experience and other immersive experiences. I really think, on any issue, whether it's Israel-Palestine, race, the biggest hurdle is to get people to see that there's an issue that they're involved in, that they're implicated in. And so, often that doesn't happen with a conversation by telling someone, hey, X, Y, Z. It happens by allowing them to sort of hold up their own beliefs against sort of a reality that they may have not fully engaged before. So we've seen a lot of impact. We've done about 112 delegations to Israel-Palestine, the majority with evangelical Christians who are walking away sort of with a deeper understanding of their faith, but also, a deeper understanding and nuanced understanding of Israel as well as Palestinians. And what that means is that, we have similar sort of like tagline to our work as J Street on our Israel-Palestine work, pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace, that there are actually communities using that language around the country now. And we're small. I don't want to sort of like talk about our outsized impact. But I think what's important to understand here, even beyond the trips, there's a maxim that we use at Telos that culture is upstream from politics. So ultimately, I think, we all know that part of the reason why this conflict persists is a political problem. But just as we were talking earlier about sort of the rise of Christian Zionist movement, and these cultural products like Hal Lindsey's book and the Left Behind series and all of that, it took a while for this cultural shift to manifest into political movement. And I'll bring you back to President George H.W. Bush's first term and withholding the loan guarantees to Israel. James Baker was the one who spearheaded that, an evangelical Christian. Who was leading this process. He may have had pushback from others who didn't like that policy, but there was not an organized Christian Zionist lobby at that point. It took a while for that to mature. Why is that significant? A lot of work that we sometimes dismiss as marginal about building relationships with these communities, particularly those that might work with us on this issue and potentially other issues, or not, writing a story that is different around this so that, Christians can there's a way that Jesus told us to love not just our neighbors, but our enemies. I need to actually love everybody as God loves them. Everybody's created equal. We're all made in the image of God. They'd sell them whatever that is, whatever that story is that allows people to see and think and engage this issue in a different way. I think that's important and that's necessary work. And there's a lot of opportunity for that.
I think there is a lot of opportunity, and I might have been an outlier in terms of many of the communities I work with in believing this, but I also thought there was a lot of opportunity within different officials who were working with the Trump administration. I spent time with Vice President Pence's staff team, and I spent time in the White House and time at the State Department. And a number of leaders were conservative Christian leaders. I was concerned about the favoring of Christian perspectives, in government. I think that was certainly not a strength, but in conversations with Christians who are part of the administration, evangelicals specifically, or evangelicals, who supported the administration, the vast majority want to be good. The vast majority want to honor God. I walked away from my first meeting with the Trump White House and was overwhelmed by how much Middle East policy was affected by people who believed that shifting Middle East policy via Israel, was going to be constructive for our country. I fundamentally think that they're wrong. I think that when we esteem Israel and ignore the needs of the Palestinians, it's not in the best interest of Israel. So I often say, if you can't care about, ending the occupation for the sake of Palestinians, care about it for the sake of Israel as well. Yeah, and the Israeli security establishment agrees with us, right, that the occupation is not in the best interest of Israel. And so I hope, certainly, as a Christian and evangelical myself, we can care about the liberation and future of the Palestinian people for their own sake. But I think it's just really important. Evangelicals are often written about not only as a monolith, but just like they're crazy. And actually, many of them are really, really wonderful people who have a monocular perspective about certain things and are reasonable when you engage with them in constructive conversation, or when you introduce them, to incredible Palestinian mothers who just want to raise their kids in peace, just the way Israeli mothers want to raise their kids in peace. Being introduced to the humanity, which I know Telos trips do such an amazing job at, and people being able to meet people in the region, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, in Israel and in Palestine, I think is a transformative experience. And I just want to point people to a resource because I keep forgetting to mention it, but we put together a resource particularly for evangelicals, but it might be of interest to this conversation. It's a book I co-edited. It's called A Land Full of God, Christian Perspectives on the Holy Land. And it has 30 chapters by Christians who are well-known in the US context. Many are evangelicals. The former editor of Christianity Today wrote a chapter. The chapters are very short. But the head of the US International Christian Embassy wrote a chapter, and she's an ardent Christian Zionist. And then Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote a chapter, and his chapter is called Apartheid. And regardless of if we feel comfortable with that term, I think understanding his thoughts in that regard is a helpful contribution to the conversation. And in that regard, I think when people are willing to converse with those with whom they disagree, or to meet people who they might not otherwise have sat across a table from, it allows us the opportunity not only for our ideas to be expanded, but for us to be transformed by those types of encounters.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that we have time for to get to some of the Q&A questions. And I know Greg has a hard stop at 3:30. I want to ask one more question, and I apologize, but I'll ask you just to keep your answers somewhat brief so we can get to some of the participant questions. But I think we've been sort of alluding to this throughout this talk, about the way that the American evangelical and Jewish communities actually really mirror each other. And I know I'm not speaking with a lot of nuance, and I want to respect that neither community is a monolith. But in general, you have a sort of older, more conservative guard that has taken a sort of pro-Israel at any cost stance. And then you have like younger or more progressive iterations that are grappling with the realities of occupation and more justice oriented, especially in the millennial generation. And so there's this sort of parallel track, and yet, at least from where I'm sitting, I've seen very little interreligious dialogue or action. Why is that? And is that changing, or is there room for that to change? Or do you even agree with that premise? Greg, do you want to start?
Sure. I want to make 2 points, one on your question and a transitional point related to questions in the Q&A, if I might. On this point, I can go back to my time on the negotiations. So we did have a vision for faith communities and faith leaders. They would kind of be the window dressing or the, seal of approval on whatever agreement the negotiators came up with. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem, though, is when you're doing sort of this peacemaking around a multi-generational issue, is that you really, you want to shift government. That's going to have the biggest impact. You want to shift policy, but you've got to have some connectivity among the people on the ground. And many of the initiatives, the interfaith initiatives or multi-faith initiatives, would often take people who are in positions, like titular positions of power, like this bishop, this rabbi, this person over here, who didn't necessarily have a following. And this is really critical within Judaism and Protestant Christianity, that, a lot of these communities, they're not part of these hierarchical monolithic structures. They're people who are listening to these leaders who felt very much and were very much excluded from the process, sometimes legally for their political views and whatnot. But what I think the major issue has been a lack of representation within the process. It was sort of like outsourced to a lot of people like me, who have elite educations and didn't grow. And, I have family there who is actually poor, but I'm not, a representative of that family. So I think that's significant. One just other small point here is just that we're talking about a lot of these, what we see as negative movements throughout history among evangelicalism. There have been evangelical abolitionists. There were evangelicals against apartheid, against, every horror out there that was sometimes sanctioned by other evangelicals. And quite frankly, many of these movements were the dispositive movements that helped build bigger movements to, transform some of these systemic injustices. Same thing's happening today. So the numbers may not be there, but the opportunity definitely is.
Yeah, and just in terms of multi-faith dialogue, there has been a history of ebbing and flowing in terms of how constructive that's been. So there was a group that was around for many years called NILI. I can't ever remember what acronyms stand for, but something about the National Interreligious Leadership Organization. But it was co-convened by Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Rabbi David Saperstein was a part of that. I sat on it for a number of years. The leadership, it was Cardinal McCarrick, who since has had a falling with the Catholic Church. So there's a number of reasons why that group doesn't exist. The reason I mention it, though, is the leaders of different denominations within Christianity, Jewish traditions, and Muslims sat side by side specifically to talk about issues related to Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. And right now, in the US context, there is not an appetite for that. And some of it has to do with, the further conservatism within different sects within Christianity. Some of it has been that there's not been a will of leadership. Some of it has been that there's been such discord in terms of possibilities for peace with the political establishments. But at different times in history, there's been success in some of those conversations, or at least a willingness to sit across the table. And a place where I would say we saw that, and I'm very hopeful for the Biden administration that we can see it as well, is under the Kerry State Department. Under the Obama administration, there was a significant role for religion in global affairs. And one of the subcommittees of that was subcommittee on the role of religion in conflict mitigation. Jews, Muslims, Christians, other religious traditions. I had the privilege of co-convening one of those subgroups on the role of civil society. But it was an amazing opportunity to talk amongst the diversity, not monolithically, of religion, to say, how can religious actors in the US context educate our own constituents, but also constructively play a role in influencing foreign policy, but also in advocating for peace that's sensitive to our theological investment, in questions like, peace in Israel and peace with the Palestinians, which for Christians, many people might not understand this. Jerusalem is our holy city, just like it's your holy city, right? I mean, and that might sound audacious, but the sacredness of the space is so significant, for us from our religious tradition, that we're invested as if it's our homeland as well.
Yeah. So I want to move to participant Q&A, but I am confused by where those questions are going. Okay, I think here is one. From Glenn Rogers. What are the largest or most active denominations across rural America wedded to Christian Zionism beliefs? How does it manifest itself in formalized church doctrine in these denominations?
I can give a quick response to that. The reality is most evangelical churches are non-denominational churches. So there's a few evangelical denominations, but that would be the exception to the rule. And so in large part, you don't have the institution you don't have denominational institutions within evangelicalism the way you do within mainline Protestantism. And so, the rootedness comes from the history. It comes literally from words in the Bible, like God's promises to Abraham, to make him a blessing. And how is that interpreted? But a lot of times it's not quite institutionalized in the same way because evangelicalism is much more dispersed rather than denominationalism.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. So I think it looks like many of the questions in the chat have been answered. So I think it would be, we just have a couple of minutes left. So I'd love to end with looking to the future. So we saw under the Trump administration very much had the ear of more conservative evangelical Christian Zionists. We saw the embassy move, we saw the solution and such. With Trump gone, what is there? Has the evangelical Christian Zionist movement lost the ear of the White House? There's so many other issues facing this administration. Is Israel-Palestine going to even rise to the level of something that is going to be looked at? And how are you both going to be moving forward in this new political climate? Greg, do you want to start since you might have to jump off?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one, to start to reiterate a basic point is that the communities that care are the communities that matter. This community cares. There's no way to think about the future of Israel or Palestine, whatever your politics are, without understanding that these communities are and will always be a major source of either problems or opportunities. And so that may sound really general. And I know on this short call, like a lot of people may walk away like, well, these folks support settlements and they do all this. And that's true for some, it's not true for all. And they're on a journey. And a lot of folks are on a journey. So what they're doing today does not mean this is what they will be doing 10 years from now. So accepting that this is a reality that we need to deal with and recognize is fundamentally important. Second, that we're way behind, in even having this conversation. I can tell you as somebody who has been working on this for a few years, people didn't want to talk. They wanted to dismiss it until sort of the Trump administration. And then they started to realize that, oh, well, maybe this is an issue. Now, even with the Biden administration, we realize that these communities in the States aren't going anywhere. And now, as I described earlier, they're actually growing like wildfire internationally. So there's something that needs to be dealt with. Third is, I guess, I don't want to force a hopeful, point here where things are complicated. I want to be honest that this is a complicated issue without sort of clear resolution in the next few months or years. However, what is important to recognize is that movement building generally, effective movements on intractable issues often include unusual suspects, strange bedfellows. We have dismissed those. For those of us who come from the progressive background, we see a whole host of issues that we want to advocate on. And there's a difference here. A lot of Telos alumni wouldn't feel comfortable entirely in the J Street space, even though they might agree with J Street on Israel, just because of the larger worldview that is put forward, which they don't agree with. And what I'm suggesting here is that I think, this is not dialogue work, this is movement building work. How do we build an effective movement to hold power to account? How do we build effective movements that can call things out in our friends and our foes that are wrong? And how do we do that so that no matter who's in the administration, we have the ability to hold that power to account? That's what the traditional pro-Israel movement did with a bipartisan consensus. I think that's possible with a new consensus that centers fundamental human rights for both Israelis and Palestinians. And I think that's possible, not tomorrow, but certainly within a decade if we get busy.
Thank you. And let me know if you need to go, but I'm wondering if you have a second to just flesh out when you talk about people who are a part of the Telos community might not feel completely comfortable in the J Street community. For those who don't know Telos, can you sort of just in a sentence explain what you mean by that?
Sure. Like a lot of the folks we're not a faith-based institution, by the way. So we operate based on just fundamental values. You can go to our website, telosgroup.org, sign up for our newsletter, gain some perspectives into some of these communities. A lot of our folks are Christian. I'd say 3/4 of the people in our network and our trip alumni at least, and many of them are evangelical. I'd say about 30 to 40% of those who are evangelical are politically conservative. So may have voted for Trump, and a larger percentage are theologically conservative. So there may be real differences on like issues that I personally care about, like marriage equality or, gender equality and women's reproductive rights. And those are issues that there'd be strong sort of disagreement over, gun rights, for example. But there may be absolute alignment on sort of at least how Israel-Palestine might be dealt with at a political level. And that's the opportunity that needs to be focused on this issue, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Mae, if you want to also.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think some of the opportunity we've talked about already really comes in the next generation, that it is a new day. And I think we need to be really attentive to providing opportunities for the next generation. I love that J Street U does that. You know, the organization I lead, CMEP, has a group called 1835 that's focused on people between the ages of 18 and 35. And I think it's really important that that age demographic not lose the history, because I think sometimes perspectives can be like a pendulum. And so while the next generation of evangelicals might not be tied to some of these really conservative theological beliefs, they're much more justice oriented. How do we make sure that they have an understanding of the history that allows them to respond constructively and holistically? I think one of the opportunities within evangelicalism, is the number of evangelicals who are not included in those statistics of the white evangelicals who voted for President Trump, right? Which honestly, in this most recent election, I just heard statistics from Robert Jones that the number of white evangelicals who voted for Trump in November was not that much less than the number of white evangelicals who voted for Trump in the first election, which to me was devastating. Not because, because I believe, his leadership was so, I want to use good words. His leadership was so poor that we really had to take a stand. And so I often say that evangelical support of him in the presidency was a bastardization of our faith, that it was a distortion of what evangelicalism is all about. And so I just put several links to resources in the chat, but Robert Jones, who did those statistics, wrote a book called The End of White Christian America, which brings me to where I think the greatest hope is. And that's in evangelicals of color, that there are communities of people that have, rich history and experience and theological investment from an evangelical perspective, while also being justice oriented, that God cares about equality, and that's equality for Israelis and Palestinians and equality for people of color in the US, and so those types of principles, I think, are a wonderful opportunity for the future of evangelicalism as increasingly people of color will take the lead.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end. I know that Greg had to jump off, but I want to thank you both so much for taking the time and for letting me ask you questions. And I think we're going to turn it back to Abby.
Thank you so much, Arianna. I just wanted to take the time on behalf of J Street. Thank you so much for all of you who joined. This was, I have to say that I learned so much. It was just really engaging and enriching and just fascinating topic. So thank you so much to Dr. Reverend Mae and Arianna for being here, and Greg, who left, was also excellent, and it was just so interesting. I am also going to just pivot for 1 second to just remind everyone that we have a national conference coming up in April, and I'm just going to paste the link in the chat for people to sign up if you have not already done so. We would love to know that you're coming. And again, just thank you so much for being part of this. Again, Arianna and Dr. Reverend Mae Cannon, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Good to be with you.